A morning like any other, until it wasn't. The morning sun stretched its golden fingers across the small town of Fairview, casting long shadows over the quiet streets. It was the kind of town where life moved at a steady pace, where people knew each other's names, and where the scent of fresh coffee and bacon frying in diners filled the air at sunrise. Harold Jennings adjusted his army cap as he walked, his steps slow but steady, a cane tapping lightly against the cracked sidewalk. At 76, he carried the weight of years, memories of battle, long nights on foreign soil, and a lifetime of service to a country that had not always returned the favor. His uniform was long packed away, but the pride of service never left him. The golden eagle embroidered on his cap gleamed in the morning light, a silent testament to the sacrifices he had made. He had just come from the VA hospital, a place he had grown accustomed to over the years. The arthritis in his knees had worsened, but pain was an old companion. He didn't complain. There were men he had served with who never made it home. Compared to them, he was lucky. As he approached Miller's Diner, he let out a breath, grateful for the familiar sight. It was a small, old-fashioned place, the kind that had been around for decades. Black and white checkered floors, worn red booths, and a counter lined with faded bar stools. The bell above the door gave a sharp jingle as he stepped inside. The scent of coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air. A few customers sat scattered around. An old trucker at the counter, a woman in the corner sipping coffee while reading a newspaper, a young couple near the window sharing a plate of pancakes. It was a quiet, peaceful morning. Harold made his way to an empty booth near the window and carefully sat down, leaning his cane against the side of the table. The sun streamed in, catching the edges of parked cars outside, the peeling paint on the gas station across the street. He took a moment to enjoy the warmth on his skin, a small comfort in an otherwise ordinary day. Behind the counter, Melanie Carter, a waitress in her mid-20s, stood gripping a coffee pot. Her blonde hair was pulled into a ponytail, her uniform crisp, her face carefully neutral, until she saw him. Her grip on the coffee pot tightened. Her blue eyes flickered with something unreadable, a slight stiffening in her posture. She walked over, her sneakers squeaking against the linoleum floor. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone clipped. Harold looked up at her, offering a polite nod. "I'll take a coffee. Black. And the breakfast special, if you've got it." She didn't write anything down. Instead, she crossed her arms, shifting her weight onto one leg. "We're full," she said flatly. Harold blinked. He glanced around. A couple was finishing their meal in the far booth. 2 seats at the counter were empty. The place wasn't full at all. "Doesn't seem too full to me," he said evenly. Melanie exhaled sharply through her nose. "We're not serving right now." His fingers drummed lightly against the table. He had seen this before. Years ago, in places where he wasn't welcome. Back then, the signs had spelled it out in bold letters. Whitey's Own Illinois. Now the rejection was quieter, hidden behind fake politeness and flimsy excuses. Harold met her gaze, steady and unshaken. "I serve this country," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I earned the right to sit here and have a meal." Her expression hardened. "I don't make the rules." The diner had quieted. A few heads turned, conversations pausing just long enough to pick up the tension in the air. An older man near the counter furrowed his brow, but said nothing. Harold had spent a lifetime choosing his battles. He was too old to let people like this push him aside. "I'll wait," he said simply. But Melanie's patience had run out. Her face darkened with irritation as she spun on her heel and marched toward the phone near the register. Without hesitation, she picked it up and dialed. "Yeah, I need an officer at Miller's Diner," she said, her voice sharp. "There's a man here causing a disturbance. He won't leave." Harold didn't move. He just watched her. The weight of history pressed against him once again. But something told him this time would be different. When the call was answered, the quiet hum of the diner had shifted into an eerie stillness. Every customer could feel the tension that had settled over the room like an approaching storm. The rhythmic ticking of the old clock above the counter sounded louder now, as if marking the seconds before something inevitable happened. Harold Jennings sat unmoved, his hands resting on the table. His grip was steady, his fingers slightly curled as they brushed against the rough surface. His body may have aged, but the years of discipline and experience had shaped him into a man who did not break under pressure. Across the room, Melanie Carter placed the receiver back on the cradle, her face a careful mask of control. But her fingers betrayed her, twitching slightly as she turned back toward the counter. She was confident she had done the right thing. She had expected Harold to cave, to mutter something under his breath, and leave before the police arrived. But he didn't. He simply sat there. The rest of the diner's patrons had different reactions. Some avoided looking at him, pretending they were too engrossed in their meals to notice what was happening. Others exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort growing by the second. At the counter, Frank Reynolds, a man in his late 60s with a weathered face and a thick mustache, let out a slow breath. He had been coming to Miller's Diner for over 40 years. He had seen the world change, and he had seen the ways it hadn't. He stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, glancing at Harold with something that wasn't quite pity, but wasn't indifference either. "This ain't right," Frank muttered under his breath. Beside him, Jess Whitman, a middle-aged trucker in a faded ball cap, scratched at his stubbled chin. "Yeah," he agreed quietly. "But what can you do?" Frank turned his head slightly, giving Jess a look. "Maybe speak up for once." Jesse shifted in his seat but said nothing. A few feet away, Emma Barnes, a middle-aged schoolteacher who had been sitting alone with her morning coffee, was frozen in her seat. She had always believed herself to be a good person, someone who stood against injustice. But now, faced with the reality of it, she felt paralyzed. The room was heavy with silence. Then, the sharp wail of sirens cut through the morning air. The sound sent a ripple through the diner. Forks clinked against plates. Conversations hushed entirely. Through the large front window, the flashing red and blue lights of a patrol car bounced off the parked cars lining the street. Harold remained still. He had seen men panic under pressure. He had seen soldiers freeze in fear, but he had also seen those who stood their ground, even when it wasn't easy. He had chosen to be one of them. The bell above the door jingled loudly as the diner door swung open. 2 officers stepped inside. Authority enters the room. The first officer, James Caldwell, was a tall man in his early 40s with a squared jaw and sharp blue eyes. His uniform was neatly pressed, his posture stiff as he scanned the room. His hand hovered near his belt, close enough to his holstered firearm to remind everyone in the room that he was ready to use it if necessary. Behind him, Officer Ryan Carter, a younger man in his mid-30s, followed a step behind. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes locked onto Harold immediately. The weight of their presence was undeniable. Melanie straightened, a smug satisfaction flickering across her face as she quickly stepped forward. "Officers," she said, her voice sweetening slightly now that authority had arrived. "That's him." She pointed toward Harold, her polished nails stabbing the air in his direction. "I asked him to leave, but he refused. He's making me and the customers uncomfortable." James Caldwell took a slow step forward, studying the elderly man sitting in the booth. But the moment his eyes met Harold's, something changed. The rigidness in Caldwell's shoulders loosened slightly. His sharp expression softened, just a fraction, but enough for those paying close attention to notice. The diner, once again, seemed to freeze. Harold remained seated, his gaze unwavering. Caldwell's mouth parted slightly, recognition flickering in his eyes. Then, in a voice that carried through the room, he said, "Sergeant Jennings." Harold let out a slow breath, finally shifting his eyes upward to meet the officer's gaze. There was a brief silence before he nodded. "Caldwell." His voice was even calm. "Didn't expect to see you here." Melanie's confidence faltered. Her eyebrows pulled together in confusion. She glanced between them, trying to piece together why Caldwell suddenly looked like he had just seen a ghost. The entire diner watched in stunned silence. "Wait," Melanie spoke again, her voice tinged with uncertainty. You know him." Caldwell ignored her, his eyes still locked onto Harold. "You pulled me out," Caldwell said quietly, almost to himself. Then his voice grew stronger, more certain. "Fallujah, 2004. Harold gave a slow nod. "That's right." Caldwell let out a slow breath, rubbing the back of his neck. The tension in his jaw faded completely, replaced by something much heavier. "Sir," he said, his voice now carrying a different kind of weight. "You." He stopped, as if unsure how to say the next part. Then, shaking his head, he turned to his partner. "Stand down." Ryan Carter hesitated, shifting uncomfortably before finally stepping back. The shift in the room was palpable. Whispers began to spread through the diner, people exchanging hushed words as realization rippled outward. Melanie's lips parted, but no words came out. Her carefully built authority had crumbled in an instant. Caldwell turned, his gaze darkening as it landed on her. "You called us on Sergeant Jennings?" he asked, his voice laced with something cold. Melanie took a step back. I didn't know." "You didn't know," Caldwell repeated, his jaw tightening. "Or you didn't care." Melanie's mouth opened and closed, but she had no answer. From the counter, Frank Reynolds let out a low chuckle. "Damn shame," he muttered, shaking his head. "A man serves his country, and this is the thanks he gets." Caldwell turned back to Harold, his voice quieter now. "Sir, He swallowed hard. "I'm sorry this happened." Harold gave him a long look. Then he nodded. "It ain't your fault," he said simply. But everyone knew the damage had already been done. The consequences of a choice. Melanie Carter felt a deep, twisting nausea settle in her stomach. The weight of the room had turned against her. She had believed she was in control. She had believed she could do what she did without consequence. But now, she wasn't so sure. The manager, a stocky man with a white apron tied tight around his waist, finally stepped forward. His face was unreadable, but his voice carried finality. "Melanie," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Take off your apron." Her heart pounded. "Wait, what? You heard me." His voice was firmer now. Now, a cold wave of dread washed over her. "But," she started, her voice faltering. I was just following the rules." Frank scoffed. "Nah, girl, you were following your own rules." A deep silence settled over the room once more. Melanie swallowed hard. Her hands were shaking as she reached up and untied her apron, pulling it off and tossing it onto the counter. She turned and walked toward the back, her steps unsteady. She didn't look back. As the door swung shut behind her, the room felt different. The tension hadn't vanished completely, but there was a shift, one of realization. Harold adjusted his cap and stood, reaching for his cane. He pulled a $20 bill from his wallet and set it on the table. He didn't need a free meal. He just needed people to be better. The manager opened his mouth to protest, but Harold spoke first. "Just make sure this don't happen again." Then, with steady steps, he walked toward the door. And this time, when the bell jingled as he stepped outside, it rang through the diner with an entirely different meaning. Melanie stood frozen in place as the weight of what had just happened crashed over her like a tidal wave. The moment Officer Caldwell had recognized Harold, the power she thought she wielded dissolved into nothing. She had been so sure of herself, so sure that she was in the right, that she had the authority here. But now the entire diner was staring at her, their gazes shifting from curiosity to disbelief, from discomfort to quiet condemnation. Harold Jennings, the elderly black veteran she had so callously dismissed, had not just been another old man wandering in off the street. He was a war hero, a man who had fought for the very freedoms she took for granted, a man who had saved lives. including the life of the officer she had called on him. The gravity of it was suffocating. Melanie's breath came in shallow gasps as she turned to Caldwell, hoping for some way out of this, some justification. But what she found in his eyes was something worse than anger, disappointment. She had expected authority to back her up. Instead, authority had turned against her. The power of recognition. Caldwell exhaled through his nose, his sharp blue eyes still locked on her. The stern expression on his face didn't waver, didn't soften. "You called us on Sergeant Jennings," he repeated, his voice level but laced with controlled frustration. Melanie swallowed hard. I didn't know who he was," she stammered. Caldwell's gaze didn't waver. "That's the problem." The words hit her like a slap. She looked around, her face burning, hoping to find someone who would stand up for her, someone who would say she wasn't wrong, that she had only been doing what she thought was necessary. But no one did. Frank Reynolds, the older man at the counter, had seen everything. He took a slow sip of his coffee before shaking his head. "Girl," he muttered, "you really stepped in it today." Jess Whitman, the trucker, gave a low whistle, rubbing at his chin. "Dan Shame," he echoed, shaking his head. Emma Barnes, the schoolteacher, finally spoke, her voice uneasy. I should have said something sooner," she admitted, her hands curling around her coffee cup. "I saw what was happening. But I didn't want to get involved." Melanie's pulse pounded in her ears. She turned back to Caldwell. "I didn't mean anything by it," she insisted, her voice growing desperate. "I was just—" "You called the cops on a veteran for sitting in a diner," Caldwell interrupted, his tone sharp. Melanie flinched. "And don't tell me it was just about policy," he continued, "because if this had been any other man, any other white man, you wouldn't have picked up that phone." His words landed like a hammer. I didn't know." Melanie tried again, but this time, the excuse sounded hollow even to her own ears. Harold, who had remained silent for most of the exchange, finally let out a quiet breath. He adjusted his cane, standing up slowly. The entire diner watched as he turned to face Melanie. His eyes, though weathered with age and wisdom, held no malice. But they held something even worse. Knowing. "You didn't know who I was," Harold said, his voice low but steady. "Or you didn't care." Melanie swallowed, unable to answer. He gave her a long, measured look. "This ain't the first time I've seen this," he continued. "Probably won't be the last. But people like you ain't as subtle as you think." She clenched her hands into fists. "I was just trying to do my job," she snapped, trying to hold on to some shred of authority. Frank let out a dry chuckle. "No, honey. You were trying to make sure a black man knew his place." Melanie's breath hitched. The entire diner had turned against her. The manager steps in. A deep voice cleared its throat from behind the counter. It was Tom Grayson, the owner of Miller's Diner. He had been silent through the whole ordeal, standing back and watching it unfold. But now, as the weight of it settled over the room, he couldn't stay silent anymore. "Melanie," he said, his voice carrying the authority she had so desperately craved. She turned toward him, her face pale. "Take off your apron." Her heart dropped. "What?" she whispered. Tom's gaze was firm. "You heard me." Her hands trembled as she took a step forward. But I don't care," Tom cut her off, his voice sharp. "We don't do this here." The words stung. She had never imagined this morning going this way. She had thought she would handle a problem. Thought she would be right. But now she was the problem. Her hand shook as she reached for the strings of her apron. The fabric felt heavier now, as if the weight of her decisions had sewn itself into every thread. Slowly, she untied it, pulled it off, and set it on the counter. Tom nodded toward the back door. "You're done here," he said simply. A fresh wave of nausea rolled through her. She had expected the police to remove him. Now she was the one being forced to leave. She wanted to argue, to say something, but she couldn't. because deep down, she knew they were right. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the back. Her legs felt unsteady, her steps uneven. The silence in the diner followed her, pressing down on her shoulders like an unbearable weight. She didn't look back. A lesson without words. As the doors swung shut behind Melanie, the diner felt different. The silence that remained was not one of tension, but of understanding. Caldwell exhaled heavily, shaking his head. He turned back to Harold. "Sir," he said again, quieter this time. Harold lifted a hand, stopping him. "Ain't your fault, son." Caldwell gave a stiff nod, but the look in his eyes said he still carried the weight of what had just happened. The manager sighed, rubbing at the back of his neck. "Sir," he said, hesitating, "I'd like to cover your meal. On the house." Harold studied him for a long moment before shaking his head. "I didn't come here for a free meal." Tom looked down, shame flickering in his expression. Harold reached into his wallet, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and placed it neatly on the table. "Just make sure this don't happen again," he said simply. Tom nodded. "It won't." Harold adjusted his cap once more, then turned toward the door. He felt the eyes of every person in the diner on him as he walked, his cane tapping against the checkered floor. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped outside. This time, it was not the sound of rejection. It was the sound of change. As he made his way down the street, he caught sight of Melanie sitting on the curb. Her arms were wrapped around her knees, her breathing uneven. For the first time that morning, she wasn't angry at the consequences. She was angry at herself. Harold met her gaze for only a second. He could see the words forming on her lips. An apology, an excuse, something. But he didn't stop. He didn't need an apology. Because some lessons don't come with words. Some lessons come with silence. And as the sun climbed higher in the sky, Harold Jennings walked away, not as a man who had been defeated, but as a man who had reminded the world of its own reflection. The weight of silence and the burden of change. The bell above the door gave a final jingle as Harold Jennings stepped outside, leaving behind a diner full of quiet contemplation. The air outside was crisp with the lingering chill of morning, yet the rising sun brought with it a warmth that settled over the town of Fairview. Harold stood still for a moment, adjusting his army cap before gripping his cane a little tighter. His joints ached, not just from age, but from a lifetime of wear and tear. The weight of service had never truly left his body. Behind him, through the glass window of Miller's Diner, people were still seated at their booths. Some were finishing their meals in silence, others murmuring in hushed voices. But one thing was clear: everything had changed. He turned his gaze toward the curb, where Melanie Carter sat with her arms wrapped around her knees. She was staring down at the pavement, her fingers twitching as she picked at the fabric of her uniform. She hadn't expected this morning to go this way. She had thought she was in control, thought she was doing what was right. Now she sat outside, her world unraveled by a single truth. She had been wrong. So damn wrong. Harold studied her for a moment. He could see it, the way her breath came uneven, the way her face was pale, her lips slightly parted like she wanted to say something. She looked up, her eyes searching his, desperate for something, for forgiveness, for understanding, for someone to tell her she wasn't a bad person. But Harold had nothing to give her, because some lessons don't come with comfort. Some truths have to sit heavy on the chest, like a weight that refuses to lift. So he held her gaze for only a second before turning away. He walked forward, his cane tapping rhythmically against the sidewalk. He didn't need to say anything. He didn't need to give her the grace of his voice. The silence was the lesson. And Melanie? She was left with nothing but the consequences of her own choices. The town takes notice. The moment Harold disappeared down the street, the diner's door swung open again. Frank Reynolds stepped out first, followed by Jesse Whitman, then Emma Barnes. They stood there for a moment, watching as Harold's figure faded into the town, his slow but steady walk full of the dignity no one could take from him. Frank shook his head, slipping a hand into the pocket of his flannel jacket. "Damn shame," he muttered. "Man serves his country, saves lives, and still gets treated like that." Jesse shifted on his feet, his hand shoved deep into his jeans. "We should have said something sooner," he admitted, guilt thick in his voice. Emma swallowed, hugging her coat tighter around her. "I saw what was happening," she murmured. "I knew it was wrong. But I didn't want to get involved." Frank let out a slow breath. "That's the thing about injustice," he said. "Ain't just about the people who do wrong. It's about the folks who stay quiet while it happens." A beat of silence followed. Jesse turned his gaze toward Melanie, who was still sitting on the curb, her head bowed, her fingers clutching her apron like it was an anchor keeping her from falling apart. Frank nudged Jesse with his elbow. "Go talk to her," he said. Jesse hesitated. "What the hell am I supposed to say?" Frank shrugged. "Maybe tell her what nobody else did before today." Jesse sighed, rubbing the back of his neck, but after a moment, he walked forward. Melanie didn't move as he approached. He crouched down beside her, resting his forearms on his knees. "Rough day, huh?" She let out a hollow, bitter laugh. "You think?" Jesse nodded slowly. "Yeah." A long silence stretched between them before he finally said, "You messed up, you know." Her breath hitched slightly, but she didn't deny it. Jesse exhaled heavily. "Thing is, we all do. Just." He let out a tired chuckle. "Most of us don't get called out for it in front of a whole damn diner." Melanie lifted her head, her eyes glassy. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered. Jesse studied her. "Didn't mean for what?" She swallowed, looking away. Jesse's voice was steady, but firm. "Didn't mean to get caught, or didn't mean to be wrong." She flinched. He shook his head. "Ain't no way to justify it. You did what you did 'cause you thought you could. 'Cause you thought nobody would say otherwise. You saw a man who looked different, and you thought he didn't belong." Her hands clenched around the fabric of her uniform. Jesse sighed. "Now you know better. Question is, what the hell are you gonna do about it?" She blinked up at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean you can sit here feeling sorry for yourself, or you can actually change." He shrugged. "Up to you." Melanie stared at him, searching his face for mockery, for judgment. She didn't find any. Jesse wasn't angry. He wasn't gloating. He was just tired. Because he had seen this kind of thing before. People thinking they could get away with things because no one called them out. People thinking they were better than others, only to realize, too late, that they weren't. And now Melanie was sitting in that uncomfortable realization. She nodded, swallowing past the lump in her throat. I think I need to be alone right now." Jesse nodded. "All right. Just don't let this be the end of the lesson." With that, he stood up and walked away, leaving Melanie alone with her thoughts. Harold's quiet victory. Meanwhile, Harold Jennings made his way to the park bench down the street, easing himself down with a quiet groan. He sat there, stretching out his sore leg, watching as life in Fairview moved on. The world didn't stop for injustice. It didn't pause for a moment of reflection. But Harold knew that change didn't happen in an instant. It happened in moments like these, where people had no choice but to confront their own biases, where silence became heavier than words, where a girl like Melanie Carter had to sit with the weight of her actions and decide whether she wanted to be better. He tilted his head up toward the sky, letting the sun warm his face. He had been through worse, and he had hope that maybe, just maybe, Fairview would be a little different after today. A little fairer, a little kinder. And if not, well, he had never been afraid to fight for what was right, and neither should anyone else. The echo of a moment and the price of change. The town of Fairview moved on, as towns always do. The diner doors swung open and closed, customers came and went, and the morning rush gave way to the slow hum of an ordinary afternoon. But for some, the day was far from ordinary. For Harold Jennings, the encounter at Miller's Diner was nothing new. It was an echo of a past he had lived through too many times before, just with different faces, different words, different excuses. But there had been something different about today. For Melanie Carter, everything had changed in a matter of minutes. The authority she once thought she had was stripped from her, replaced with an uncomfortable truth that settled deep in her chest. The weight of her actions, the shame in every set of eyes that had turned against her, made it hard to breathe. For James Caldwell, the police officer who had once owed his life to Harold, today had been a painful reminder of the world he had returned to after war. A world where even the men who had saved lives could still be treated like they didn't belong. For the town of Fairview, something had cracked, something unspoken but deeply felt. And now, the real question remained. Would anything change? The weight of reflection. Harold sat on a weathered wooden bench in Fairview Park, his cane resting beside him. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves rustling in a quiet rhythm. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and the distant scent of roasting peanuts from a vendor cart by the playground. He watched the world move. Mothers pushed strollers down the paved walking path, children ran across the grass, and old men played chess on stone tables beneath the shade of an oak tree. It was peaceful, and yet he could still feel the echoes of the morning weighing on his shoulders. He had told himself he wouldn't dwell on it. He had faced far worse in his life. He had lived through segregation, through wars fought in foreign lands, through protests and marches that had been met with batons and fire hoses. He had learned to let things roll off his back. But as he sat there, staring out at the town he had called home for decades, he couldn't help but wonder. How many people had been silent in that diner, not because they agreed with Melanie, but because it was easier to stay quiet. Harold sighed, rubbing his fingers over the golden eagle embroidered on his army cap. Maybe silence was the real enemy. A man who couldn't let it go. James Caldwell had tried to push the morning's events out of his mind, but it wasn't working. He had gone back to the station, filed his reports, even tried making a few routine stops, but his thoughts kept circling back to the diner, to Harold, to the way the town had hesitated before stepping in. It made him angry. Not just at Melanie, not just at himself for not realizing sooner, but at the whole damn situation. He sat in his squad car, parked outside Fairview Grocery, gripping the steering wheel. His knuckles were white. Harold had saved his life in Fallujah. That man had pulled him out of burning wreckage, covered in his own blood, while bullets rained down around them. And today, Harold had been treated like a criminal for sitting in a diner. Caldwell exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. He thought about his own family. His father, a hard-working blue-collar man who had raised him to respect people not for their skin color, but for their character. His father had told him stories of the civil rights movement, of neighbors who had stood on the wrong side of history, of good men who had done nothing while bad men did their worst. Caldwell had always told himself he would be better, and yet today he had walked into that diner, ready to arrest a man without even knowing the full story. He hated that. He hated himself for it. With a heavy sigh, he unbuckled his seatbelt. There was one person he needed to see. A knock on the door. Harold had barely been sitting for 20 minutes when he heard the crunch of boots on the sidewalk. He didn't have to look up to know who it was. Caldwell. The officer stood in front of him, looking as if he had been carrying a weight just as heavy as Harold's. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Caldwell let out a slow breath. "Sir, I..." He stopped, shook his head, then tried again. "I needed to come see you." Harold tilted his head slightly, studying the younger man. "That right?" Caldwell nodded. He shoved his hands in his pockets, looking down for a moment before meeting Harold's gaze again. "What happened today? It wasn't right." His voice was quiet, but firm. Harold didn't reply. He just waited. Caldwell swallowed, the guilt in his expression plain as day. "I walked into that diner ready to believe her." His jaw tightened, didn't even question it. didn't stop to think. He took a breath. And that scares the hell out of me. Harold leaned back slightly, considering him. But you did stop. Caldwell shook his head. Not soon enough. He let out a slow, frustrated exhale. I should have known better. Should have done better. Harold studied him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. Yeah, you should have. Caldwell flinched at the blunt honesty but didn't argue. He knew Harold was right. Harold shifted, adjusting his cane. But you did something most folks don't. Caldwell frowned. What's that? You came here. The words settled between them. Caldwell let out a heavy breath, then slowly sank down onto the bench beside Harold. He ran a hand through his short, cropped hair. I don't want this town to be like that, Caldwell admitted. I don't want to be like that. Harold nodded slowly. Then don't be. A long pause. Then Caldwell asked the question that had been burning in his mind all day. How do we fix it? Harold let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Ain't a simple fix, son. He gestured around the park, the town, the world beyond. Ain't something you solve with a couple apologies and a free meal. Caldwell nodded. He had figured as much. But, Harold continued, it starts with folks like you. Folks who see what's wrong and don't just walk away from it. He turned his gaze toward the officer, his weathered face calm but certain. You want to fix it. Start speaking up. Start listening. Start making sure the next time something like this happens, folks don't just sit there waiting for someone else to say something. Caldwell took in his words, absorbing the weight of them. Then he nodded. For the first time that day, Harold saw something in the younger man's expression. Resolve. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start something. In the shadows of the past, the future takes shape. The town of Fairview had not changed overnight. But the echoes of that morning had not faded. A police officer had been forced to confront his own biases. A waitress had been stripped of her false sense of superiority. A town had been reminded that silence was as dangerous as hatred. And Harold Jennings, he had done what he had always done. He had stood his ground. And now, the world had to decide if it was finally ready to stand with him. The fire that would not burn out. The echoes of that morning at Miller's Diner refused to die. Though the world had carried on as it always did, a quiet storm brewed beneath the surface. Some wounds leave scars, others leave questions, uncomfortable, lingering questions that don't disappear just because the day moves forward. Harold Jennings had spent a lifetime watching history repeat itself. He had learned, long ago, that moments like these didn't end when the door swung shut. They grew. They planted themselves in the hearts of people, in the spaces between their thoughts, forcing them to reckon with things they had long ignored. Some tried to forget, but not this time. This time, the moment had clung to the town of Fairview like smoke after a fire. The conversations no one wanted to have. At Miller's Diner, things were not the same. The usual routine was disrupted. The hum of small-town conversation, once carefree, now carried weight. Melanie Carter was gone. Fired. She hadn't returned to the diner since that morning. Some people whispered about where she had gone. Some said she left town, too ashamed to stay. Others said she was hiding out at her mother's house, unwilling to show her face. But the truth was, no one really knew. And the people left behind, they were forced to deal with what happened in their own ways. Frank Reynolds, the old man at the counter, had been coming to Miller's for more years than he cared to count. He had seen the town shift, seen faces come and go, but he had never seen the kind of silence that had settled over the diner now. Every time he walked in, he could still feel the weight of that day. The way Melanie had looked when she picked up that phone. The way the rest of them had hesitated before doing anything about it. He didn't like that feeling. So one morning, when the diner was quieter than usual, he spoke up. "You all think this is just gonna go away?" he asked, setting down his coffee cup with a thud. A few people looked up. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Emma Barnes, the schoolteacher, sighed. Frank. No. Ain't no Frank about it, he interrupted. Ain't nobody gonna talk about what happened, what we saw, what we didn't do. A young man near the counter cleared his throat. What's there to talk about? Frank gave him a long, tired look. The fact that we all sat here and let it happen, for one. The young man shifted in his seat. That ain't fair. It all happened so fast. Nobody knew what she was gonna do. Frank shook his head. Nah, we knew. The second that man walked in, we saw the way she looked at him. We saw what was coming. And most of us just sat on our hands, waiting for someone else to say something first. Emma exhaled, staring into her untouched coffee. I did see it, she admitted, and I didn't say anything. Frank scoffed. And why's that? She didn't answer right away. But finally she muttered, because I was afraid. Frank leaned forward, resting his arms on the counter. Afraid of what? Emma's fingers curled around her cup. Afraid of getting involved. Afraid of making it worse. She hesitated. Afraid of what other people might think. The words sat heavy between them. Frank let out a slow breath. And that right there is the damn problem. Silence. Then Jess Whitman, the trucker, let out a dry chuckle. Well, ain't no way to fix it if we don't talk about it. Frank nodded. Exactly. And so, for the first time, they did. The conversations that had been avoided, the ones that had been buried under the weight of shame, finally began to surface. People asked themselves the hard questions. Why hadn't they spoken up sooner? Would they do it next time? Did they even realize how deep the problem ran until that moment? It wasn't a pretty conversation, but it was necessary. The letter that arrived at Melanie's door. Across town, Melanie Carter sat in her childhood bedroom, staring at the blank ceiling. She had barely left the house since that day. Everything felt different now. It wasn't just that she had lost her job. It wasn't just the humiliation. It was the gnawing truth that had sunk deep into her bones. She had grown up believing she was a good person. Now she wasn't so sure. And that doubt, that was the worst part. She had spent the last few days avoiding people, ignoring phone calls, and sinking into the discomfort of her own mind. But that morning, when she went to check the mail, she found a letter waiting for her. There was no return address, just her name. Her hands trembled slightly as she tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. And at the top, in carefully written letters, was a name. Harold Jennings. Her stomach twisted. She hesitated before reading the words beneath it. Melanie, I don't know if you expect to hear from me. Maybe you don't want to. Maybe you do. Either way, I'm writing this because I think you need to hear it. You did wrong. You know that. The whole town knows that. But the question is, what are you going to do about it? Regret won't fix it. Avoiding people won't fix it. Running away won't fix it. The only way to fix it is to change. That's on you. And you're the only one who can decide if that's something you're willing to do. Harold Jennings. Melanie's hands gripped the edges of the letter, her heartbeat loud in her ears. She read it again. Then again. And then, for the first time in days, she let out a long, shaky breath. She had a choice. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about how unfair it all felt. She wasn't thinking about excuses. She wasn't thinking about what people would say about her now. She was thinking about what kind of person she wanted to be when this was all over. Because maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of her story. Maybe it was the beginning of a different one. And for the first time since that awful day, she felt something stir inside her. A possibility. A chance to be better. The town that would not stay the same. Fairview had changed. The diner was different. The people were different. The silence that had once been comfortable was now unbearable. People started speaking up in ways they never had before. People started noticing the things they once ignored. And Harold Jennings, he kept living. He kept walking through town, with his cane and his army cap, not as a man demanding change, but as a man who had forced the world to see itself. And that, he knew, was where change truly began. It wasn't in grand speeches. It wasn't in news headlines. It was in the moments, in the silence, in the hard conversations, and in the people who finally chose to do something about it. The road to redemption and the echo of a lesson. The town of Fairview would never be the same. The moment at Miller's Diner had ignited something that no one could put back into place. For some, it was an ugly wake-up call. For others, it was a quiet relief, proof that things were changing, that people were finally paying attention. But for Melanie Carter, it was a reckoning. Her mother had tried to console her, telling her that people would forget, that things would blow over. But deep down, Melanie knew better. Some things don't just fade. Some things become a stain that you either learn from or let consume you. And Melanie had spent the last few weeks deciding which kind of person she wanted to be. The letter had started it all. Harold Jennings hadn't expected Melanie to respond to his letter. When he had written it, he wasn't offering her comfort. He wasn't offering her an easy way out. He had given her a choice. And for weeks, he had wondered if she would take it. Then, one morning, a knock came at his door. Harold, who had been sitting by the window reading his newspaper, glanced up. The knocks were hesitant, uncertain. He already knew who it was before he opened the door. And when he did, he wasn't surprised to see Melanie Carter standing there. Her posture was stiff, her hands gripping the straps of her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. But it was her eyes that caught his attention. There was no anger there, no excuses, just a quiet kind of shame. And maybe something else, a need to make things right. Harold didn't speak first. He simply leaned against the doorframe, waiting. Melanie swallowed. I got your letter, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Harold nodded, figured. She shifted on her feet, looking like she wanted to disappear. I didn't know what to say, she admitted. For a long time, she exhaled. I just kept thinking about how everything happened so fast. How I never even stopped to think before I acted. Harold didn't reply. She forced herself to keep going. I kept trying to convince myself that I wasn't a bad person, she said, her voice cracking slightly. That I was just following the rules. That I didn't mean anything by it. Harold gave a slow nod. And what do you think now? Melanie let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. I think I don't get to decide that, she said. I think I did something that was wrong, and no amount of excuses will change it. Harold studied her for a long moment. Then he stepped back and motioned toward the porch. Sit. Melanie hesitated for only a second before nodding and stepping forward, perching on the edge of the wooden rocking chair. The street was quiet, the sun warm but not oppressive. Harold eased himself back into his own chair, the old wood creaking beneath him. For a while, they just sat there in silence. Then Harold finally spoke. So, why are you really here, girl? Melanie's throat felt dry. Because I don't want that to be the person I am, she said, barely able to meet his eyes. And I don't know how to fix it. Harold let out a slow breath, nodding. That's a start. She looked at him. That's it. He gave a small shrug. You thought I was gonna tell you how to fix it. Melanie shifted uncomfortably. I don't know. Harold chuckled, shaking his head. Ain't my job to fix you, girl. That's on you. Melanie swallowed, nodding. I know. Harold tapped his cane against the wooden floorboards. What you did that day, that ain't something that goes away just 'cause you feel bad about it. That ain't something that gets wiped clean with an apology. Melanie nodded again. I know. You can't undo it, Harold continued. But you can decide what comes next. Melanie's hands tightened in her lap. Harold exhaled, glancing at her. So, what comes next, girl? She didn't hesitate this time. I want to be better, she said. I want to learn. Harold nodded. All right. Melanie frowned. All right. Harold grinned slightly. You expecting me to throw a parade? She flushed. No, I just. You want to learn? Then listen. Harold leaned forward. You've been listening to yourself a whole lot these past few weeks, haven't you? Melanie hesitated before nodding. That's the problem, Harold said simply. She blinked. What do you mean? I mean, girl, you're real caught up in how you feel, Harold said, his voice calm but firm. You feel bad. You feel ashamed. You don't like how people look at you now. And that's all about you. Melanie flinched. Harold tapped his cane against the floor again. So stop focusing on you for a second. Stop thinking about how it feels to be the person who did wrong, and start thinking about the people you did wrong to. Melanie felt the truth of those words settle in her chest like a weight. Because Harold was right. She had been so focused on her own shame that she hadn't stopped to think about how many people like him had lived through that kind of treatment their entire lives. She had been living in this moment for weeks, but Harold had been living in it for a lifetime. And that was something she couldn't ignore anymore. The road to something better. That day on Harold's porch was only the beginning. Melanie didn't get a quick fix. She didn't get a moment where everything magically became better. Instead, she started small. She started reading, really reading, about history, about the things she had been blind to before. She started listening to conversations she once ignored, to people she once dismissed. And most importantly, she showed up. She started volunteering at the local community center, getting involved in projects that actually helped people. She started standing up in moments where she once would have stayed silent. It was slow. It was uncomfortable. But that's what growth looked like. And Harold, he watched. He didn't give her a gold star, didn't tell her she was suddenly a good person, because that's not how this worked. But one day, months later, when he saw her speaking up in a conversation at the grocery store, when he saw her correct someone instead of just standing there, he gave a small, knowing nod. Maybe, just maybe, she was changing. And that was enough. Because redemption wasn't about erasing mistakes. It was about learning from them. And for the first time in her life, Melanie Carter was learning. The town that chose to see Fairview would never be the same. Because once you see something, you can't unsee it. The silence that had once kept people comfortable had been shattered. And Harold Jennings, he kept walking through town, cane tapping against the pavement, knowing that this time, things would be different. Because now, people were paying attention. And that was worth everything.